Whether it's an intense investigation, an escape scene, a puzzle, a killing game, visual novels have this incredible ability to make us feel unsettled and anxious. While gameplay is important, one way beyond everything that visual novels help to achieve this is using music. Imagine you're asked to create anxiety in a visual novel in an opening scene. Your natural instinct might be to include some engaging, some intense dialogue lines between characters, but do you need dialogue at all? Somnium Files is a really good example of this. Within the first 2 minutes of experiencing the game for the first time, we feel this intensity that sets the tone of the game perfectly. It starts with lightning, followed by a subtle glockenspiel, and that glockenspiel has delay as well going on behind it. There's a synth pad, which adds to the backing intensity of the entire scene, and gradually the accordion comes in, which makes us feel very unsettled. We then hear a sub-hit, as we begin to zoom in closer to the scene. Now, I think the really interesting thing is that we would expect the rain to start immediately because that's literally what's going on in the scene. But I think there's something really poetically beautiful about hearing the elements come in one by one, rather than just dumping a whole load of unsettling sounds immediately. As the camera starts to pan around, we start to hear the rain and all of the other sounds become louder and more intense, followed by the introduction of the main theme. Now, this is the thing that really stands out to me in creating that unsettling feeling, is that the main theme doesn't start immediately as the track starts. All the elements come into the piece one by one, really gradually, building up that intensity for the player. The piano, interestingly, in that main theme, has a kind of backwards delay effect, which sounds like this. And finally, as we start to see Shoko's eyes, then we hear the boom, the sub-bass hit, followed by the distorted synth sounds. It's subtle, it's not over the top, but it does just enough to create those feelings within ourselves. Following this, the track stops. The synth remains whiny. There's still singing going on. It's still creating a really intense and unsettling ambience. At the end, we hear strings playing in A on multiple octaves. But at the same time, there's actually 2 other notes going on in the background. It's really subtle, but it's an E and an F, which inherently clash with each other. Somnium Files is a good example of a series of games which do it in very particular ways, using sound design and ambiences as well as music itself in really cool and interesting ways. But to move on to a different game series which does it in a completely different way, Your Turn to Die. Conveniently timed given the recent announcement. In the case of Your Turn to Die, the most obvious example for me is Major Panic. It is the dictionary definition of how you create a piece which instills fear and anxiety into the player. It also introduces a common theme we'll see across other pieces throughout this video, and that's repetition and intense, fizzy sounding string instruments. When I say repetition, I'm referring to the oscillating between 2 particular tones within the string instruments, which sounds like this. The reason it sounds so unsettling is because it creates the interval of a minor second. Musical intervals just describe the distance between 2 particular notes, and a minor second always sounds unsettling. Compare that to a major second, which sounds like this. You know that feeling in a game when you haven't saved in a while and you have a fear that something bad is literally just about to happen, but you can't save at the moment? Well, that's the feeling that I get when I hear Suspense from Ace Attorney. Realistically, I could have picked any suspense theme, let's face it, but I'm gonna focus on the first one because I think it makes the most sense. At least, it's the one that comes in my head when I think of themes which create unsettling feelings in Ace Attorney. And here we hear something very similar to Major Panic. We hear those repetitive, fizzy sounding strings again, which create that anxiousness and that intensity to the entire scene. When we hear that piece of music, we immediately feel unsettled, and it's no coincidence. Another detail that I've always quite liked is the bass drum in Suspense as well. I don't know why, but to me it feels like a heartbeat. And if you need any bigger demonstration that this sort of effect works, even when we're using more realistic sounding instruments, then the great Stray Suspense from the great Ace Attorney is an incredible example of that. Here we see an incredibly similar thing to Suspense and Major Panic. The oscillating between only a handful of select tones, few pitches, works incredibly well in creating that intense feeling. The more unpredictable the piece is, in many ways, the less unsettling it sounds because you know you're expecting something unpredictable, but the more predictable, consistent, but also rapid it sounds, the greater the feeling of intensity. Before we move on, did you know that this channel is anxiously close to 7,000 subscribers? So please make sure to subscribe to the video, it really does help out. Let's take Danganronpa as a really good example. Think to yourself, pick one piece across any of the games that made you feel a feeling of anxiousness at all. One of the really obvious ones that come to mind for me is this. But then I paused for a second and thought, did this actually make me feel anxious, or am I just pretending that it did? I had to really dig deep and think back to my experience playing the game and work out, did this piece actually make me kind of like feel on edge? And the answer kind of is no, because I feel like this is a very obvious piece in terms of feelings of anxiousness and feelings of intensity. The piece that actually comes to mind is complete reverse of that. Desire's execution does all the right things in the right places to really trigger that feeling inside of me that, oh no, something bad has literally just happened. It's where it really starts to hit home that there's a character that I'm literally never gonna see again. And it's because it does the complete opposite of a theme like Suspense or Major Panic or anything like that. It's a little bit closer to the opening of Somnium Files, if anything. Soft, atonal sounding pads in the background. We have notes which are constantly clashing, but it's not so upfront, it's not in your face, unlike those other themes. Now, this isn't to say that there's a best way of creating an anxious piece in a video game, because there absolutely isn't, it really depends on the scene. But I think, for the context, the time and the place, this works best. So what is it that creates those feelings in this piece itself? Well, reverb is a really, really important part of it. The fact that the piece feels so open, so empty, a feeling of loneliness and spaciousness, like you're walking in a massive open field at night and there's just no sign of life. At least that's how I feel listening to this. With all this talk of anxiousness and everything, one thing that helps me to relax is, this is not going to be a sponsored bit of the video, don't worry, but join the EF Discord. It's really nice and it's very calming. Thanks. And so what game does it best then? And when I say best, I'm purely talking from my own experience playing these games and how I personally felt playing these games, and that's going to be different for everyone. But the one game that does come to mind is Zero Escape 999 in particular. No joke, I just looked through the entire 999 OST, and I'm pretty sure that I could point to almost every single piece and identify something that creates feelings of anxiousness, even a piece like 9 Years, which isn't supposed to do that at all. But the piece that I want to focus on is Trepidation, because that's the piece that immediately comes to mind when it comes to feelings of anxiousness within the entire game. And you'll notice immediately that it does incredibly similar things to those previous pieces, the opening strings which sound discordant, that sound terrifying, that clash. It manages to achieve this using very few sounds as well. Strings for one, at the beginning, we have those stabs of the piano and percussion, tremolo swells with a few different instruments, an electric piano playing light random notes on top of the entire piece. Very reminiscent of Morphogenetic Sorrow actually. And that piano that comes in as well. There are a few more elements, but the idea is it's minimalistic, it's simple. It uses elements because they need to be in the piece, not because they're there just because they can be in the piece. And that's the thing. Visual novels create anxiety in various different ways. We have the more upfront and in-your-face ways of doing it, like Major Panic from Your Turn to Die, or the suspense themes from Ace Attorney. But on the other end of the spectrum, we have the more subtle ways of doing it, the more gradual, such as the opening of Somnium Files, or alternatively, Trepidation from Zero Escape 999. Whatever it is, the consistent theme here is that instruments are used very tastefully. and in a way which is quite minimal in the sense. Instruments are used because they add to the feeling, not just because you have access to them.